And I just wanted to start by saying that I think this has been a really excellent Marxist Forum series. And if you've missed any of the previous sessions, I recommend watching the videos which are on our YouTube channel. So today we're going to talk about Marxism and oppression. And I think I'm right in saying that everybody accepts that oppression exists. That there are people who are oppressed. Even to our ruling class, oppression exists, although they'd have you believe it's only ever done by other people somewhere else. But I think to the vast majority of people, there is an understanding that people are oppressed here in our society, that especially racism and sexism are forms of oppression which are prevalent in society and for the most part are understood as structural issues. And apart from the various surveys which show this and the outbursts of protest in the last 2 years of Black Lives Matter and against violence against women following the murder of Sarah Everard, I think this fact is also evidenced by the way the government has tried to respond and to exonerate itself of this reality. In the Sewell report, which was published last year, the government claimed that there is no such thing as institutional racism, arguing that we no longer see a Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. And similarly, reports into the institutional sexism in the police or the gender pay gap, which sometimes acknowledge that there's a problem, tend to focus on, look how far we've come, or explaining it as isolated or individual problems rather than something that is rooted in the system. And while I think most people can see through this garbage, there is a debate on how oppression functions, who benefits from oppression, and therefore what needs to be done to end it. And often the prevailing view is that oppression is a question of individual attitudes. Some see it as an inevitable characteristic of human nature that has always existed and which can never be fully eradicated. While others think that it can be educated out of people's minds and that insofar that it's structural, it is a question of who we have in power, i.e. A matter of representation or diversity at the top. And I think in both these views, there is the idea that the beneficiaries of oppression are the people who aren't being oppressed, i.e. men from women's oppression, or white people from Black people's oppression, and so on. And I think these ideas miss the point about how oppression is inflicted and experienced, and the fact that the dynamic of oppression is a function of exploitation. And I think this is where the Marxist understanding of where oppression comes from offers a holistic and materialist view of how oppression works and therefore provides a route towards liberation. And I want to try and explain this concept primarily around understanding racism, and mainly because we've discussed women's oppression in previous sessions and the videos are online and I recommend people watch them. And I think the comrades who did those meetings explained it better than I could. But what I will briefly say is that for the benefit of this discussion is that in his book, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels outlines how in the development of human societies, it was the establishment of private property and the accumulation of wealth and thereby the development of class society that constituted what he called the world historic defeat of the female sex. And what he notes was that while at the time the role of women in the household remained largely the same, it was the dynamic of power as a result of the social processes of production outside the household that gave men the advantage over women and that created the conditions for the subjugation of women. And understanding that oppression is inherently linked to the social relations of production is, I think, key. And we can see that even more clearly with the development of racism, which is a far more recent phenomenon. And I think we can track the origins of racism as an ideology, as a form of oppression based on the color of a person's skin to the transatlantic slave trade. And I want to spend a little bit of time explaining A, why slavery was absolutely integral to the development of capitalism, B, how racism is a product of it, and C, what that means for how racism exists today. So the way slavery is taught about in schools and the common misconception, I think, about it is that it was a product of racism, whereas in reality, it was the other way around. Racism was a product of slavery. And what I mean by that is, as Marx explained, without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry. Slavery was central to the development of capitalism in several ways. Firstly, the free labor of slaves on the plantations allowed for the growth of supernormal profits, which were invested back into all parts of the system back in Europe. And in Britain, for example, the development of port cities like Bristol and Liverpool were almost entirely financed by the slave trade. We saw sectors from sugar refining to guns to cotton and wool textiles grow massively. And the financial industry in the city of London was built on the investment generated from the slave trade. And you can look at banks like Barclays and Lloyds, insurance companies like Lloyds of London, and so on. And this provided a counterweight to the tendency for the rate of the profit to fall, which was imperative for capitalism to grow in its early stages. And the slave trade also allowed for the plunder of resources from the colonies on the one hand, and the creation of new global markets to create new commodities to sell to on the other. And this whole process is described very well in a book called How the West Came to Rule, the Geopolitical Origins of Capitalism in chapter 5, and I recommend people read that. Because what they also describe is how the plantations in the Americas became laboratories for the development of both new technologies and new labor processes, which were then implemented back home in the factories in Europe. The extraction of super profits from the plantations as a result of slave labor meant the cheapening of the value of labor in Europe in the factories. And the book quotes Marx in saying that the establishment of free wage labor in Europe needed as their fundamental precondition the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal. Now, prior to the slave trade, there were, of course, existing forms of discrimination based on people's tribes, based on religion, and slavery too existed. And I think it's worth noting that slavery was, even in its ancient form, a product of class society, from the production of goods for exchange, which created a value for human labor that could be exploited and so by extension could be captured by force. But the key difference between ancient slavery and that of the transatlantic slave trade was that it wasn't organized by skin color, and it was a far more fluid relation. For example, the Romans would enslave people that they categorized as barbarians, but they could educate themselves out of slavery. In parts of Africa, enslaved people could be made key officials in the functioning of the state, and who lived lavish lifestyles. And in other parts of the world where slavery existed, people could, for example, convert to a different religion to escape bondage, and so on. But with the transatlantic slave trade, there was a need to create an essentially limitless supply of free labor. Unlike indentured white laborers who initially brought onto plantations at the onset of the colonization of the Americas, but who would be free after time served, the capitalists needed to create a category which was inescapable. And initially, the church played a role in justifying the enslavement of Black people by saying they were kind of paying for their sins of not believing in God. But that left a route open for slaves to convert to Christianity and to then no longer be, fit into this category. And later, the church rode back and argued that even if an African slave were to convert to Christianity, they still had to, pay penance for their past sins of not believing in whatever. But what happened around this time was that philosophers like John Locke and so-called biological scientists created a kind of pseudo-scientific explanation as to why Black people were simply a different species, an inferior species, and that therefore enslaving them for the betterment of the white race was only rational. It meant that a Black person could never escape bondage because they were branded for life. Their children would be born into slavery and remain slaves for the rest of their lives. And with this, we see the origins of racism as an ideology, as an organized practice, given intellectual backing and enforced in the most barbaric way. And this development of scientific racism was then also used in transforming religious prejudices into similar forms of racism, such as anti-Semitism and more recently with Islamophobia, by racializing the groups and associating inescapable characteristics to them. And I think understanding this Marxist analysis of how racism originated is of central importance to the struggle against racism today, because it helps to understand that racism is not separate to exploitation, but fundamentally rooted in it. And that is why it has remained a key tool for capitalist expansion ever since. As Walter Rodney, the Marxist historian, commented, oppression follows logically from exploitation so as to guarantee the latter. Oppression of African people on purely racial grounds accompanied, strengthened, and became indistinguishable from oppression for economic reasons. And if we recognize racism as a feature of exploitation, we can then see that there are two reasons why racism was maintained following the end of slavery, and despite the abundance of evidence against any kind of scientific basis for it. Firstly, it was so that the bosses could super exploit Black people who were now part of the working class. And secondly, it was to pit white workers against Black workers and ensure that they weren't organizing against them. And Angela Davis explains this quite well in Women, Race and Class, when she says the colonization of the Southern economy by capitalists from the North gave lynching its most vigorous impulse. If Black people, by means of terror and violence, could remain the most brutally exploited group within the swelling ranks of the working class, the capitalists could enjoy a double advantage. Extra profits would result from the super exploitation of Black labor, while white workers' hostilities towards the employer would be diffused. And it's in this that we can see who the real beneficiaries of racism are. Following the 1646 Chesapeake rebellions, I said that right, where indentured white laborers and African slaves revolted together on the plantations, the plantation owners redefined the law to give slightly extra privileges to the European workers compared to the African slaves. And this had the effect of breaking the solidarity among them, of making white workers think that they were better off than the Africans, and making Africans see the white laborers as beneficiaries of their oppression. Similarly, fast forward to 1919, during a massive strike wave in the US, white trade unions refused to organize with Black workers because they believed the Black workers were part of bringing down the wages of white workers, and because they bought into these racist ideas. And the effect was that the strikes ended in defeat for the workers, and the workers blamed each other, and this resulted in a summer of race riots in which numerous people were killed. And in both these cases, what we can see is that while a white worker might be marginally better off compared to a Black worker, they're not benefiting from the oppression of the Black worker. In fact, the opposite. They are helping to maintain their own exploitation. And Sharon Smith, an American socialist, notes that the bosses use the conditions of the lowest paid workers to drive down the conditions of all workers. The worse the pay and conditions of the most oppressed workers, the more the bosses can lower the pay of all workers. Conversely, when the conditions of the most oppressed sections of the working class are improved, the conditions of all workers improve. And that explains why in the South, where rampant racism has been used to divide workers and keep unionization rates extremely low, the pay of white workers, though better than that of their Black counterparts in the region, is historically lower than the pay of Black workers in the North. So we can see why the capitalist class needs to oppress. And if we look at the realities faced by Black people today, we can see how this functions. As well as being paid lower by the bosses, they are by and large forced to live in substandard and overcrowded housing. They are over-policed and over-incarcerated. They are less likely to have educational and job opportunities compared to their white counterparts, and so on. And this is manifested structurally by the state itself. You can see how the police forces, which some of the earliest of which in the United States were established primarily to catch runaway slaves and to put down slave rebellions, continue to this day to target Black people. And in London last year, the Deputy Commissioner of the Met Police openly said that they have an institutional practice of targeting Black people and try to justify it. And we saw, for example, in the first 3 months of the lockdown in 2020, that the equivalent of a quarter of all young Black males in London was stopped and searched, and over 80% of them resulted in no further action. And it's through looking at this more closely that we see that one of the key ways in which structural racism is manifested is through the prism of class. People who try to explain racism using what is sometimes called identity politics, i.e. the idea that we all identify as something, and some of those categories are more or less oppressed than the others. I think they picture some kind of Venn diagram where, you have a circle which is Black, and a circle which is a woman, and a circle which is gay, and a circle which is working class. And these sometimes intersect. And if you identify as one or more, and your oppression is kind of thereby compounded. And I think the mistake of this idea is that it imagines that these oppressions are separate rather than fundamentally intertwined, and that class is just one of these identities rather than the primary division in society. And it therefore obfuscates who benefits from oppression, because it de facto assumes that if you're not in one of these oppressed circles, you are then benefiting from that oppression. The reality, I think, if we kind of stick with the analogy of the Venn diagram, is that these different circles of oppression are almost entirely encapsulated within a big circle of the working class. And that's not to say that these oppressions exist only as part of the exploitation of the working class. They clearly don't, as I've tried to outline, but that the vast majority of Black people, of women, of LGBT people are working class, and that their exploitation is on a class basis, and that the oppression they face sharpens and further exploits them as part of this. And I think this is key to understand, and it's why I think Marxism offers a view in a kind of in totality and a route to liberation, because it identifies clearly that we are not, in fact, part of separate groups competing with each other to be less oppressed, but we are by and large part of the same class who are being exploited and oppressed in different ways by the same people to keep us in that position, to divide us from each other, and to stop us from stopping them at the top who are actually benefiting from our exploitation. And the route to liberation that it offers, therefore, is that our unity on a class basis has the means to overthrow that system. And I think it's important for socialists to make this argument, because while of course it is our job to work together with anyone who wants to counter racism, I think the direction of a movement will depend on the dominant ideas in that movement. And I've seen, for example, firsthand with the Black Lives Matter movement, when it first emerged in Britain, that it kind of fell apart and was stymied by the prevalence of these ideas. I remember going to an organizing meeting of one of the first, shortly after one of the first Black Lives Matter marches, I think it was in 2016. And after a brief discussion, there was a decision to kind of elect a kind of working group who would lead, who'd help organize the next protest and so on. And that descended into absolute chaos, because the conversation became who should be allowed to lead a Black movement. It can only be Black people. White people can't be part of it. It can only be Black people. Brown people can't be part of it. And soon it could only be dark-skinned Black people and not light-skinned Black people. And so the movement completely fragmented. And often, as part of that discussion, what came out was that it was the people who had kind of more radical ideas, more socialist ideas, who were then stopped from participating by using this. And similarly with kind of Black nationalist explanations of racism, which kind of imagine that there has to be a unity amongst the oppressed before and above class unity, I think has proved in the past to be a hindrance to the anti-racist movement. And I remember debating a few years ago with a lecturer from Birmingham, who was talking about how the beneficiaries of the exploitation of Black people are white people, including working class white people. And he was arguing that he had gone to a picket line of, I think it was teachers outside of school at the time. And at that picket line, one of the strikers spoke out to say that at that same time, there were teachers in South Africa who were striking, and that, you know, their struggle is united and kind of offering solidarity to them. And his argument was that this is fundamentally wrong because the teachers in Britain are benefiting from the exploitation of teachers in South Africa, and therefore there can never be any solidarity among them. There can never be any unity among them. And similarly, he kind of argued for essentially kind of Garvey ideas of there being no solution to end racism for Black people in the West, and that they therefore had to kind of return to Africa, completely ignoring the role of African ruling classes in oppressing people in Africa. But yeah, and I think if you look at kind of what happened with Marcus Garvey's movement in the early 20th century, the ideas of Black nationalism helped to give confidence to Black people to fight back and to organize. But they very quickly reached a wall when they weren't arguing to mobilize further than that, and when Marcus Garvey was then arguing for people to return to Africa, which most Black people at the time didn't want to do. And so I think in these ideologies where the idea is that there has to be unity amongst the oppressed over working class unity, I think it doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. And firstly, I think when you look today at the fact that the richest MP in Parliament, who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is Rishi Sunak, when you look at the fact that the Home Secretary, who is putting in the policies that are letting refugees drown in the sea, and who is ordering the Metropolitan Police to attack people at Sarah Everard's vigil, is Priti Patel, when the Met Commissioner who just resigned, Cressida Dick, was responsible for the killing of John Charles de Menezes and various other things. That idea that a person who is a part of the ruling class and who is part of carrying out that oppression of Black people, of women and so on, that we have to have some kind of unity with them doesn't make sense. And I think secondly, it doesn't offer the process by which we can actually achieve liberation, i.e. overthrowing the system, which can only be done by the working class as the biggest exploited majority in society, and with the power afforded to it by the system which requires our labor to function. So I think I'll end with just saying that I think at the moment in particular, we have this cost of living crisis, which is affecting millions of people, which is sharpening the class divide in this country, and which is sharpening people's understanding of that class divide, where we have a racist prime minister who has so openly, said the things that he has, and where we have a defunct Labour Party under Starmer's leadership, where his deputy leader, Angela Rayner, was the other day talking about why the police should shoot first and ask questions later. The police, with the track record of the things that it does to Black and brown people, we can't look for solutions among them. And I think it is more and more urgent for us to mobilize in the widest possible way on a class basis, and to make it clear how these oppressions intersect on a class basis, and how us mobilizing and us uniting is the key to overthrowing that system. So I'll just end by saying that there's another People's Assembly demonstration on the 5th of March, and I hope that we can make it as big as possible, because I think it's so urgently needed at the moment. I'll leave it there. Thank you.